Dungeons & Dragons is not the only tabletop RPG out there. In fact, there's a lot of them. And I've played a ton of Dungeons & Dragons. Seriously, I've got hundreds of videos about it. But I do have some tabletop RPGs that I really like that aren't D&D. So I made a top 5 list that should include something for everybody. Even if you don't want something in the classic fantasy setting or you want something totally new. I tried to make sure I covered all the bases. But as far as this list, there's only 2 major things I kinda left out. First, I didn't want to include anything on this list that is more of just an add-on to a pre-existing IP. Because if you just want to play more Fallout in a tabletop setting, there's a tabletop RPG of Fallout or Persona or basically every possible popular form of media that's out there. There's a tabletop version of it. And I also didn't want to go the reverse way where it's just a system with no real world built around it, like GURPS, the General Universal Role-Playing System. So I wanted to go through some systems that feel fleshed out and feel like they can exist in a real world to play in while being a good tabletop role-playing game in the first place. So here's my top 5, and I kind of categorized each one of them. Because at number 5, we have what I'm referring to as the new Hotness. Basically, this is the new kid on the block, and they kind of came in with a bang for obvious reasons. It's Daggerheart. Now, this game is obviously built by some D&D veterans and pretty popular people in the space, considering they have one of the biggest D&D fan bases in the world, because it comes from the creators of Critical Role. This kind of built up naturally and then came to a massive head when Wizards of the Coast started to kind of shoot themselves in the foot about a year or so ago, but it has a lot of things that are pretty familiar to D&D. Most of the races and general classes are fairly familiar, and even things that are much more departed from D&D still have a Daggerheart counterpart in the Daggerheart game system. But there's some very obvious differences to D&D. The most notable mechanic is its hope and fear mechanic. You basically roll 2 dice, and then you get to see whether you succeed at something with hope or with fear. If you do it with hope, it can help your character or boost up your allies. But if you do it with fear, it gives the world something to use against you, or possibly even helps out your enemies. Because if it happens during battle, that's where it gets really tricky, because if you wind up succeeding with hope, then your ally gets to take the next turn. But if you succeed with fear, your enemy does. And this new emotional dynamic kind of keeps people more engaged, because more people are interested in what's being rolled, because it can really affect everybody a bit more. And the fact that enemies can randomly wind up having their turn in battle makes things a bit more chaotic and more realistic when it comes to battle, while at the same time keeping all players engaged and not just waiting for their turn in initiative. But at the same time, I don't think it's a perfect system. The damage is kind of funky with this minor, major, and severe damage, which kind of takes away from the idea that players can wind up in situations where they can be completely over their heads a little bit, but then they go the other way and make things a little better with the death system, where fighting against dying in the game can leave your character with permanent scars. Some of the mechanics are a bit more in-depth and take a little bit of getting used to, but this is a game and system that is built for tabletop role players by tabletop role players. And the fact that it was so hyped up and backed by such a popular creator allowed for there to be a massive play test in how this game would work. And they listened to the feedback. There were things in the original playtest material that people kind of hated, but they listened to the feedback and they addressed it and they changed it. So it's a far more enjoyable game now. It's definitely worth checking out, especially if you want to hop on the hype train for it. But at number 4, what if you want something a bit more sci-fi based? Basically take Lord of the Rings, bring it forward a couple thousand years, and mix it with cyberpunk, and then you get our number 4 spot, Shadowrun. This game has been around since 1989 and is currently on its 6th edition of the game. And again, this is not a perfect system by far, because even the original print version of the game was frankly a bit of a mess. And if you are interested in checking out a solid cyberpunk magic mix feeling game without jumping into the cyberpunk actual TTRPG, this is still a solid way to go. But I would make sure to get the Seattle or Berlin City editions of the game, because they fixed a lot of the issues with the original printing. Shadowrun mixes magic and cybertech, and it brings out different races from fantasy in this idea that there are some sort of dormant genetics within people that when they're brought out, they become things like elves or dwarves or any of the classics. And then you get to build out your Shadowrunner, which is what you are in the game, deciding on a class like a face to be more of the socializing face of the party, or maybe you want to be the classic boom boom magic fireball person, or even a cybernetic samurai, or plenty of other options. In Shadowrun, as you play as a Shadowrunner, you're sent on missions or runs, getting plenty of time before it to find out more information about your mission and do some deep diving into the world. But how you go on your mission and how you find that information is where you start diving into the mechanics, which can get a little janky at times. You get a lot of D6s to roll, you get a stunt system, and it can get a little complicated. In fact, some people often say that they hate the system but love the setting. But I've found that when you talk to really big players of Shadowrun, it's actually more that once you get past that system and once you really get used to it, you begin to love the whole package altogether. But it definitely takes a bit of getting used to, because it's a great RPG, it just has a bit of a learning curve. And there is so much content out there for Shadowrun. It's been around for a long time, and it has tons of books and adventures, and the world is so well built out. So it is really worth taking the time to sink your teeth into it. Then for number 3 on my favorite RPGs, I gotta choose an indie game, because I wanted to make sure at least one indie game was on here, and I wanted one that really deserved it. But there are tons out there. I mean, you can literally just go on Kickstarter and search for TTRPGs, and there'd be an absolutely insane amount that would pop up. And actually, some of them have sponsored this channel before, so I actually kind of use that as an excuse to reach out to somebody that's sponsored this before to sponsor this video. But it's for a game I would have recommended anyways, so I kind of just used it as an excuse to have a way to pay for this video, so just try not to tell the creators of this game, because my choice for number 3 on this list is going to be Enclave. And they did sponsor this video. I'm going to be upfront about that, but frankly, I would have recommended them anyways, for a number of reasons. One, when they did sponsor me, they actually said, we don't want you to sponsor us unless you take the time to play our game to give an honest opinion about it, because we're confident in our game. We think it's good. And then you can just share your opinions, whether it's good or bad or whatever. And then after I played a session with the creator, I get it. It's good. It's a game built with the idea of one-shots in mind, which is kind of something I generally like most of the time anyways. If there's too massive of a campaign, sometimes things can kind of get lost. But if it's built more with one-shots in mind, it's a lot easier to hop in and out whenever your availability happens to work out. So you're not trying to coordinate scheduling like the biggest enemy of every dungeon master out there. But you still have one character that you're building up and leveling up as you play Enclave continuously. And the idea of those one-shots are actually meant to be spun up on the fly. And they have a system built out for coming up with one-shots, so it really enforces the idea of improv a lot more for those that write the stories and for the characters themselves, because they got to be a bit more just in the moment. But there's 2 things I actually found especially interesting about this system specifically. One is that it's both minimal on its game mechanics while at the same time still being in depth enough to be interesting, and it's actually diceless. So I'm sorry for anybody that has the insane dice collection that they're ready to bust out at every TTRPG, because you won't need them with Enclave. But because of the simplified mechanics and the lack of need for dice and a ton of numbers, it makes it a lot easier to jump in. And it's a lot easier to do the basics of starting up your character in the first place. You still have a class to start off with, like an illusionist or a gunslinger, or what I'm currently playing when I'm playing Enclave, which is a Thunderbird. You then get to figure out what your character is good at, bad at, focus on a few things, and grab a couple starting items that very heavily influence your abilities. And then you just dive in. You come up with a general background for your character that you try to roleplay as much as possible, because it's a TTRPG. The role-playing is important. And because of how this system works, it really encourages collaboration and cooperation with the other players, and the cooperative storytelling aspect of TTRPGs in general. And because of how the mechanics work, it's much more about trying to convince the game master how your character would pull something off. And the more interesting or the more insane that it would happen while still making sense for your character, the more benefits and the more likely it is that you will succeed at doing that thing. Like seriously, when I was doing it, took a lightning bolt and tried to blast down from way up in the sky, and it turned into this massive chaotic explosion, and it was nuts. But that simplicity actually gets amped up as you wind up leveling up, and that's kind of how I feel like games should be. Easy to start at the beginning and then get more and more in-depth as you go on. Because as you level up, you can do the simple leveling up thing, just adding a few stats and an item or something, or you can get a bit more complicated and split off like it's a Path of Exile talent tree. And they actually have an expansion coming out where they have new classes like the Free Runner or the Witch Hunter. So I'll make sure to link their Kickstarter in the description and comments down below. But if by chance you really want to get a feel for it, or you want to just generally check it out, and you happen to be watching this video the day that this video comes out, my friends over at DMG are actually doing a 24-hour live stream, all for the Extra Life charity event. I'll be joining in on the streaming too, and I'll link both their stream and my stream in the description down below. And we're going to be playing a bunch of games, including Enclave. And DMG got a bunch of other D&D YouTubers to be joining in as well, like Runesmith, Cinderblock Sally, the Deck of DM Things, old friend of the channel, The Ugly Goblin, and this tiny little YouTuber that you probably never heard of called D&D Shorts. Yeah, he's supposed to hop on there too. So come on by the stream, check it out. It's for a good cause, and hopefully we'll have some fun. But let's get back to the list. Because at number 2 on the list, I wanted something a bit more horror based. Because every once in a while you want a bit more of a creepy role-playing experience. It kind of brings back the feeling of telling horror stories sitting around a campfire, but now you're sitting around a table, possibly rolling some dice. And there's some great ones out there. I was very tempted to go with Vampire the Masquerade because it's a solid horror-themed TTRPG. But instead, I want to go with a game that helped influence Vampire the Masquerade, Call of Cthulhu. Call of Cthulhu is now in its 7th edition. And that 7th edition came out in 2014, just like a certain other TTRPG. But that means that it has a ton of content that's built out for over a decade now, just on that system alone, even if you didn't want to port over older versions. It's usually based in the 1920s, but it can actually work in a lot of different time frames, because it's built around the idea of the Lovecraftian horror and Cthulhu and all those eldritch abominations. You build out a character that's an investigator trying to investigate the eldritch creepiness and arcane lore that is happening within your world. You figure out your character's occupation, what their expertises are, and certain skills and abilities. But setting up your character does take a lot of math, like a lot, rolling a bunch of dice, then multiplying them and adding certain things to them just to get your base character sheet set up. But the skills do work in a way that kind of makes a bit more sense. Like if you're really good at something, you actually roll a percentage die to see how difficult the thing is that you're trying to do against. So if you roll below your skill ability, that means you just succeed at it, which kind of makes me feel better about things sometimes, because when I roll a nat 1 in D&D and I'm supposed to be good at that thing, it's very frustrating sometimes. But if you're just coming up against something and your skill level's high and that thing happens to just be challenging, it feels different. And then on top of the basic mechanics, there's also a sanity mechanic, which seems very spot on for Lovecraftian horror. Like the entire world and the craziness that you're going up against starts to possibly drive you insane. So you can get thrown into madness and have certain mental debuffs that hit you. It's kind of a cool mechanic, and it's definitely necessary in Call of Cthulhu. But once you can get past the insane setup and all the math, it's really solid to get going. And then before I jump into what is number 1 on my list, I gotta throw out some honorable mentions on top of the couple I semi-mentioned when I was going through the others, like Shadow Dark, which is highly recommended by a ton of people, and it's basically just a simpler, more straightforward way to play D&D. Then, in case you're not sick of the ton of superhero related stuff out there, you can get a little more of it by playing Mutants and Masterminds. It's basically just playing a superhero RPG. There's other ones out there like Mask, but I think if you're going to choose one, go with Mutants and Masterminds. If you love the world of Warhammer 40k, well, there's a Warhammer RPG out there. If you want to do a bit more role-playing and a little less wargaming. There's one I was actually hesitant to try just because of the name, but it's called Bubblegum Shoe, and it's surprisingly well loved by so many people, and then after looking into it I can kind of understand why. It's actually really good. It's an interesting detective story game based in a high school, and it comes highly recommended. And then just because I need another excuse to build out another Gunpla, if you really like Gundams or mechs in general, there's a great TTRPG called Lancer, which is a game where you play as a mecha pilot. Basically, you have Gundams. But now for number one on my list, it's the most direct alternative to D&D. And it should be no surprise, it's Pathfinder. I got a chance to play 2nd edition Pathfinder at Gen Con, and honestly, I liked the system so much that I was tempted to make an entire extra YouTube channel just building stuff out in that system. Pathfinder started off as a series of D&D adventures back in 3rd edition. But then, once D&D moved to 4th edition, they got a lot more restrictive with how they were handling their content. And so Pathfinder said, screw it, we're gonna go do our own thing, which seems to be a bit of a trend for Wizards of the Coast and D&D in general. Every time they start clamping down on their IP and getting too restrictive, they suddenly give some incentive to get a whole nother competitor in the market, aka Pathfinder, Daggerheart, and I'm sure a ton of others. They should probably stop doing that if they don't want more competition. But hey, it sparked the idea behind Pathfinder, and I like that one. And Pathfinder made a point to make most of its core rules available for free, which is another big win for them. And while a lot of things are very similar to older versions of D&D, one thing that felt so good while playing is the action economy. You see, when I'm playing D&D, I cannot count the amount of times that whether I'm dealing with new players or veteran players, the action economy becomes a bit confusing or people get mixed up, and just dealing with the fact that there's actions, bonus actions, movement, free actions, reactions, and item interactions or whatever else, that's a lot to worry about. And there's certain actions you can do on certain action types. So rather than deal with all that, Pathfinder just has, hey, you got 3 actions, do whatever you want with them. So if you want to use one of those actions to move, do it. You want to use one to attack, do it. There's certain actions that might cost you multiple. So if I want to do a big thing, it might cost 2 actions, but it's still simplified. And if you want to use more than one action to attack multiple times, you might get a slight penalty to your chance to hit, but that makes sense. It just feels generally a bit more intuitive. And also, attacks of opportunity are far less common in Pathfinder, so it feels like combat is moving around a lot more. It feels more dynamic and fun. Then, on top of all of that, the martial classes are far more powerful, so it balances out against the wizard mix spellcaster that just wants to fireball everything. And it doesn't feel like you're lacking because you chose a particular class. It feels like everything's balanced, and at the same time, as you build out your character, it gets so in-depth and has so many options, and it's fun. It's so good to play. I highly recommend it. If you want something that is like D&D but isn't D&D, and you still kind of want a similar feel but you like some other mechanics, I cannot recommend Pathfinder enough. But those are my top 5, as well as some honorable mentions. If you want to check out the stream where we're going to be playing Enclave and raising some money for charity, that'll be linked down below. If you want to help support this channel, here's my Patreon, where I have a whole bunch of character sheets for D&D, and YouTube thinks you might like this video. Go ahead, click it. It helps my algorithm stuff, just like subscribing would, but this is even better because it gives you another video.